The morning air in Yellowstone's northern range still carried a bite of late spring cold when Ranger Daniel Harris began his patrol. He had driven the same route dozens of times, a slow roll through stretches of burned pine and open meadow, scanning for tracks, checking the state of the land. His notebook lay open on the passenger seat, half filled with observations about elk migration and black bear sightings. Nothing suggested today would be different. Yet, as he parked near a stand of charred trees, something small shifted in the brush. Daniel raised his binoculars, expecting a coyote pup. What stepped into the clearing froze him in place. A grizzly bear cub, alone, thin, no bigger than a medium dog. His fur was patchy ribs faintly outlined beneath the brown coat. He moved with hesitation, pausing every few steps as if listening for a mother that never appeared. Daniel lowered the glass, letting the reality sink in. In Yellowstone, young grizzlies are rarely seen without their mothers. Cubs usually spend the first 2 to 3 years under constant care, learning to dig roots, turn logs for insects, and fish in swift streams. Seeing one wandering alone at barely 5 months old was a warning sign. Something had gone terribly wrong. He reached for his radio but stopped short. To call it in now would trigger a chain of actions, rangers, biologists, and possibly relocation to a rehabilitation center. But the cub wasn't injured, just lost, just hungry. And in that hesitation, Daniel noticed something else. The cub was watching him, not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity that cut through the distance between them. Wildlife biologists often say eye contact tells a story. Most wild animals look past you, assessing threats, calculating escape. This cub's gaze lingered, almost searching, as though waiting for a signal. For Daniel, that moment felt uncomfortably personal, as if the wilderness itself had asked him a question he wasn't ready to answer. He scribbled quick notes: grizzly cub. Approx. 5 months. No sow in sight. Behavior alert. Underweight tracking ranger vehicle. The pen slowed. He added almost reluctantly, cub did not flee. That line was the one that troubled him most. Bears are supposed to be wary. Cubs without fear of humans rarely survive long. Some wander into campsites drawn by food smells. Others linger near roads until a car ends the story. It's called habituation, a technical word for a tragic path. And it begins often with a simple moment of contact. He remembered a case from years earlier when a black bear cub near the Grand Teton campgrounds began approaching picnic areas. Tourists charmed by the sight-tossed scraps. Within weeks, the cub returned every night, pawing at coolers, climbing tables. Eventually, the behavior escalated, and the bear was euthanized. A fed bear is a dead bear, the training manuals drilled into every ranger. And yet here he was confronted with a set of amber eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. The cub shuffled closer, nose twitching in the wind as though scenting the lingering trace of Daniel's breakfast burrito. Each step was small but deliberate paws pressing softly against the blackened forest floor. Daniel's pulse rose. He knew he should start the truck drive away and file the report, but a different instinct, older, harder to control, kept him still, watching. Waiting. In the distance, the calls of ravens broke the silence. He scanned the ridge for signs of the mother. No overturned logs, no fresh scat, no prints. He listened for the low warning huff a sow gives when she senses intrusion. Nothing. Just the cub moving in a half circle, never farther than 30 feet away. A wildlife biologist later explained it clearly. Mother grizzlies don't abandon cubs unless forced. Predation, conflict with a larger male, or a fatal accident on a road, these are the usual reasons. Cubs can't simply lose their mothers. Nature isn't careless, it's exacting. That fact added weight to what Daniel was seeing. This cub's mother was gone one way or another. Survival odds. Slim. Studies show that fewer than 1 in 3 orphaned grizzly cubs in the wild make it through their first year alone. And that's in areas with plentiful food. Yellowstone's spring thaw meant competition with older bears and scavengers. Coyotes, wolves, and even eagles posed threats. Each shadow in the grass could be a danger. Daniel leaned against the truck, fighting the urge to call out. His voice would only make things worse. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that silence was also a choice. In wildlife work, the line between observation and action is razor thin. When you watch suffering without stepping in, you become part of the outcome, a mentor once told him. Yet policies existed for a reason. Interfering could do more harm than good. Every ranger learned the cautionary tales. A cub raised with human assistance might never develop the right fear of people. When full-grown, that lack of fear could mean disaster for both the bear and the people it encounters. Daniel had to remember this wasn't a lost puppy, this was a future predator. And yet, the cub stopped just shy of a fallen pine, lifting his nose to the wind again. He pawed weakly at the bark as if testing whether grubs hid beneath. When nothing appeared, he sat back on his haunches, sides heaving. The small gesture was ordinary, almost mundane. But to Daniel, it revealed something larger. The cub still carried instinct. The will to forage was there, just clouded by hunger and inexperience. Maybe that was the sliver of hope. Maybe given time and minimal support, this cub could survive. He wrote another line in his notebook. Displays foraging behavior, digging attempt, unsuccessful. It was a clinical observation, but inside he felt something far less clinical: admiration. Even stripped of everything, the cub was trying. Later, when he recounted the encounter to colleagues, some asked if he had felt afraid. He admitted no. What he felt was a quiet pressure, like the land itself had handed him a responsibility. The cub's presence reminded him of an uncomfortable truth. Wilderness is not a place of guarantees. It is a place where every choice echoes. For centuries, indigenous cultures across North America viewed bears as teachers, symbols of endurance, courage, survival. Watching the cub tilt his head, Daniel understood why. There was a lesson in resilience unfolding right before him. Not wrapped in words, but in small actions: a paw digging at bark, a nose lifting to scent prey, the simple act of staying upright when every rib showed. The cub wasn't giving up, so why should he? From that first moment, Daniel knew the coming days would test more than protocol. They would test compassion, patience, and the fragile balance between human duty and wild necessity. He pulled himself back into the truck, the cub still visible in the rearview mirror. As the engine started, the little figure remained watching the departing vehicle with an intensity that lodged itself deep in Daniel's chest. He whispered to himself, "Don't follow." But in his heart, he knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The image of that small grizzly cub lingered with him long after the patrol ended. And when hunger drove the cub closer to his truck days later, Daniel faced a choice he could no longer postpone. 3 days after the first sighting, Ranger Daniel Harris returned to the same patch of burned pines. He told himself it was routine, that he needed to verify elk tracks in the valley. But the truth followed him like a shadow. He wanted to see if the grizzly bear cub was still alive. The morning sun climbed quickly, warming the ridgeline. He parked, turned off the engine, and let the quiet settle. For a moment, there was nothing, no rustle, no sound of movement. Then, as if answering a question only he had asked, the cub stepped from behind a snag. His gait was slower, ribs sharper against thin fur. Hunger had tightened his body. The cub didn't hide. He walked deliberately toward the truck, nose raised. Daniel froze. This was exactly what Yellowstone's regulations warned against: animals approaching humans with expectation. Rangers drilled the phrase into memory: habituation kills. A bear that sees people as a food source rarely survives. Yet here was a cub alone in one of the wildest landscapes in North America, staring at him with a gaze that combined fearlessness with a quiet plea. Daniel thought of the manual in his glove box, the black letters on white paper that commanded, "Do not feed wildlife under any circumstances." He also thought of the cold truth he'd written in his notebook: cub is unlikely to survive without intervention. He reached into his pack for the radio. His thumb hovered over the call button, ready to notify headquarters. Before pressing, he paused. The cub had pressed closer, paws padding softly in the dirt, head tilted as if scenting something. Daniel realized it was the faint odor of his packed lunch. The sight cut him in two: regulation versus compassion, policy versus instinct. He knew feeding even once could change the cub forever. He also knew that not feeding might mean watching him collapse in a matter of days. Wildlife biologists later framed the dilemma. Clearly, young carnivores without mothers rarely develop hunting or foraging skills. For grizzlies, the mother's presence is everything. She teaches how to turn stones for ants, how to smell roots beneath soil, how to stand in icy rivers, waiting for fish. Without that knowledge, cubs wander, wasting precious energy. Mortality rates soar. This cub was not just hungry, he was being tested by nature long before his body had grown strong enough to face it. Daniel remembered a story told in training about an orphaned lion cub in Kenya. Tourists, charmed by his small size and boldness, offered bits of food. Within weeks, the cub waited by the lodge, approaching anyone who passed. Rangers had to intervene. Eventually, the cub was placed in a sanctuary, raised in enclosures with others like him. He lived, but never learned to survive as a lion in the wild. A life was saved, yet wildness was lost. The lesson was stark. Good intentions could unravel everything nature intended. The grizzly cub circled the truck, sniffing at the tires, peering up at the open window. His movements were unsteady, but his eyes never wavered. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, whispering to himself, "Stay wild. Don't trust me." The cub's stomach growled audibly, a sound that twisted against the silence of the forest. Daniel's heart pounded. The manual said to drive away. His instincts said to stay. He decided on a fragile compromise. From his pack, he took out a strip of smoked salmon he had carried for his own lunch. He stepped out carefully, keeping distance, and laid the fish 20 yards from the truck. He didn't move closer. He didn't call or encourage. He simply placed the food and retreated. The cub paused, lifted his nose, then shuffled forward. Each step seemed uncertain, but hunger pulled stronger than caution. He sniffed the fish, glanced once at Daniel, then devoured it. His small jaws worked furiously, as if afraid the gift might vanish. For Daniel, the moment was both relief and dread. Relief that the cub had eaten, dread that a line had been crossed. A bear had learned in the smallest way that food and humans could be connected. And yet, watching him chew, Daniel saw more than he needed. He saw resilience, the determination of a young animal refusing to surrender. There was a lesson there, not in words, but in action. Survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it begins with sheer persistence. He wrote in his notebook, "Fed small portion direct placement, no contact." Cub shows focus coordination despite weakness. It was an observation, but also a confession. He had intervened. The decision could not be erased. The question now was what it meant. He leaned against the truck, eyes fixed on the cub, licking the dirt where scraps had fallen. Daniel realized this was no longer about a single act of kindness. It was about consequences rippling far beyond the moment. Later that evening, back at the ranger station, he wrestled with the choice. His colleagues argued on different sides. One said letting nature take its course was the only true path. Another reminded him that rangers sometimes rescue orphaned cubs, transferring them to rehabilitation centers. A biologist emphasized habituation, the way repeated feedings can turn wild animals into beggars, stripping them of the instincts they need. Daniel listened, but the image of the cub's amber eyes refused to fade. In them, he had seen both desperation and trust. Wild animals are supposed to fear people. That fear is their shield. Remove it, and you remove survival itself. But what if the cub already lacked fear? What if his unusual boldness had been set the moment his mother vanished? Daniel turned the question over in his mind. Was he helping or only accelerating the path toward dependence? There were no easy answers. The next morning, he drove out again, unable to resist. The cub emerged quickly, as if waiting for the familiar sound of the engine. Daniel didn't feed him immediately. Instead, he watched, notebook in hand. The cub pawed at a rotting log, rolled it clumsily, and licked at the ants beneath. The behavior was clumsy but natural. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. If instinct was alive in him, perhaps survival could be learned. Perhaps human contact didn't have to define his story. In those moments, Daniel began to see the cub not just as a creature in need, but as a mirror of bigger questions. How do we balance compassion with respect for wildness? How do we choose when to act and when to step back? Conservation isn't only about saving animals, it's about deciding what kind of relationship we want with the natural world. For Daniel, the cub became the embodiment of that dilemma. Every kindness carries weight. In wilderness work, no action is neutral. Feeding once can reshape behavior forever. Not feeding can end a life too soon. Both choices hold truth, both carry consequences. That tension is what makes stories of wild animal rescue so powerful and so haunting. Before leaving that second morning, Daniel placed another small portion of fish farther from the truck than before, then walked back without looking over his shoulder. The cub moved toward it with more confidence this time, sniffing, pawing, and chewing. Daniel climbed into the truck here, heart heavy. He drove slowly away, catching sight of the cub in his mirror, a small figure alone in the expanse, yet stubbornly alive. That night, staring at the ceiling of his ranger cabin, Daniel realized he could not keep improvising. If the cub returned, and in his gut, he knew there would need to be a plan. A choice was coming, one that would test not only his instincts, but the very ethics of wildlife conservation. At the ranger station, the discussion began before Daniel even set his hat down. Word had spread that he had seen and possibly fed a grizzly bear cub. Questions flew. Was the cub injured? Was the mother truly gone? How close had he gotten? Daniel described what he had seen. The ribs, the weak, pawing at bark. The amber eyes fixed on him as if searching for something he could not provide. He didn't mention the strip of smoked salmon at first, but he knew he couldn't hide it for long. When he admitted he had placed food, the room fell silent. Rangers and biologists live by rules written not in suggestion, but in survival. Feeding wild animals is more than discouraged. It is forbidden. Yet here stood a ranger who had crossed that line. Some colleagues argued that he had only delayed the inevitable. Others insisted he had created a dangerous precedent. One veteran ranger leaned forward, voice low. A cub that learns to rely on people stops being wild. And a bear that stops being wild usually doesn't live long. The words pressed heavily, but Daniel couldn't erase the image of the cub licking at the dirt where scraps had fallen. He asked the room, "What would you have done? Walk away knowing he'll starve, or step in and risk making him dependent?" The debate that followed was less about the cub than about the heart of conservation itself. Wildlife ethics often demand restraint. Biologists explain that mortality in young animals is part of the ecosystem's balance. Grizzly bear cubs, like lion cubs in Africa, face steep odds. Many don't survive their first year. Their loss becomes food for scavengers, and their absence shapes predator-prey numbers. Intervening interrupts those natural equations. One scientist reminded them of lions in Kenya, orphans raised in sanctuaries who lived but never hunted. Their survival was secure, but their essence as wild animals was gone. "Is existence without wildness really survival?" she asked. Daniel considered the point carefully. He had studied cases of orphan cubs taken to sanctuaries. In South Africa, lion cubs raised by hand sometimes grew tame, losing the fierce caution that protects them. Some became attractions for tourists, bottle-fed for photographs. Others lived out their years behind fences safe, but cut off from the freedom their species was built for. The intention was compassion. The outcome was captivity. Still others in the room countered with examples of successful interventions. Black bear cubs in North America had been raised in large, hidden enclosures with minimal human contact, then released into remote forests. Many adapted, some even thrived. The key difference: the way help was given. Food was provided without faces, without voices, without touch. Bears grew without connecting meals to people. It was a reminder that intervention was not always the same as interference. The conversation shifted toward practical options. Could the cub be monitored with remote cameras? Could food be placed strategically, mimicking natural foraging rather than handouts? A biologist suggested setting up fish carcasses along the riverbank to encourage natural fishing behavior. Another proposed using scent trails, dragging carcasses through the woods so the cub would follow and practice tracking. The ideas sparked hope, but also caution. Every action carries risk. For Daniel, the debate stirred something deeper. He realized this wasn't only about one cub's survival. It was about the boundary between human compassion and wild autonomy. Conservation often celebrates rescue stories, but rarely shows the cost of those rescues. The lost instincts, the dependence, the quiet captivity that replaces freedom. He asked himself, was saving one cub worth reshaping his destiny? Or was it more respectful, though infinitely harder, to let nature decide a memory surfaced from his early training? A senior ranger had said, "Sometimes the hardest work we do is not acting. To watch and not step in, that takes more courage than moving in with good intentions." At the time, Daniel thought it was cynicism. Now he understood it as discipline. But standing in the burned pines, watching the cub paw weakly at the earth, discipline had felt like abandonment. Later that night, Daniel reviewed old journals from other parks. In Alaska, rangers had documented the case of a cub left alone after a sow was struck by a vehicle. Locals wanted to take the cub in. Instead, biologists monitored from a distance, leaving carcasses in hidden places, never showing faces. Months later, the cub was spotted fishing successfully in a stream. Intervention had worked, but only because it kept the cub's fear of humans intact. That story gave Daniel a fragile sense of direction. Perhaps there was a way to help without stealing wildness. Kindness without discipline can be cruelty in disguise. To feed openly, to touch, to soothe, might feel good in the moment, but it could destroy the very independence that defined the animal's future. True compassion in the wild often looks like restraint, like support from shadows, rather than stepping into the light. He began to see the cub as more than a fragile life in need. The cub was a test, a reminder that human presence in wild spaces always comes with responsibility. To choose not just what feels right, but what preserves the essence of the wild. In that way, the cub became a mirror, reflecting the question of what kind of guardians humans wanted to be. Protectors who bend nature to their comfort, or stewards who walk carefully, allowing wild creatures to remain wild. By dawn, Daniel had resolved to try the middle path. He would not abandon the cub, nor would he tame him. Food could be offered, but only in ways that mimicked natural sources, scattered fish parts along creeks, carcasses left under logs, berries placed in thickets. He would avoid direct feeding, avoid building familiarity. He would act, but from the shadows. The next patrol, he carried a sack of fish, remains from a nearby stream, dragging it along the ground to leave scent trails. He placed carcasses under rocks and brush, then retreated to a distance with his binoculars. Hours later, the cub arrived, nose twitching, following the trail. He pawed, sniffed, tugged, and finally ate. From where he sat, Daniel exhaled, both relieved and cautious. This was the compromise aid without imprint. Ethical debates in conservation are rarely about clear right and wrong. They are about balance between compassion and respect, between survival and freedom. Watching the cub tug at a fish carcass, Daniel understood that the best interventions are often invisible. The ranger's hand should guide but not replace the lessons nature meant to teach. Yet even as the plan formed, another danger grew clear. The cub was not only learning how to forage, he was also learning to recognize the sound of Daniel's truck. Each morning, the bond between man and bear deepened. And with every step closer, the risk of habituation loomed larger. The first time Ranger Daniel Harris laid fish remains along the creek, he did it with the precision of someone trying to stay invisible. He dragged the carcasses upstream, leaving scent in the water, then wedged chunks beneath rocks where a bear might naturally find them. From a ridge above, binoculars steady in hand, he waited. The cub arrived an hour later, nose twitching, following the trail like a riddle he was meant to solve. Watching him paw, dig, and finally drag a fish head into the shallows, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Instinct was there. It only needed practice. Grizzly bear cubs learn by copying their mothers. A sow will spend years showing them how to turn stones for grubs, where to dig roots, and how to plunge into icy rivers without hesitation. Without that model, survival becomes trial and error. Daniel understood he could not replace a mother bear, but he could scatter learning opportunities. The trick was making the cub believe the lessons were his own discoveries. He remembered a case shared by a colleague who had worked in Alaska. A lone cub, orphaned after a car collision killed its mother, had been monitored for months. Biologists never let it see them. They planted salmon remains along rivers and beaver carcasses under brush. The cub followed practiced, and 1 season later was spotted catching its first live fish. It survived because its instincts sharpened without linking food to people. Daniel decided this was the path he had to take. Day after day, he varied the placements. Sometimes a salmon belly under driftwood, other times a trail of berries scattered across a meadow. He even tied scraps to a cord, dragging them through the grass to mimic prey movement. From a distance, he watched the cub stalk, leap, and wrestle with the bait as though it were alive. Each attempt built muscle coordination and confidence. Daniel scribbled notes furiously. Stalk behavior, eyes narrow, low posture, leap unsteadily but effectively. Improvement from last week. The notebook became less report and more chronicle, capturing a wild animal relearning his birthright. There was a mystery in the way the cub responded. One afternoon, Daniel watched him roll a log, twice his size, tongue darting as ants scattered. The cub licked at the swirl with enthusiasm, exactly the way adult bears supplement their diet with insects. Nobody had taught him this. Somehow instinct had surfaced. Daniel sat back, breath held, realizing nature had not abandoned him after all. Hunger had driven him, but wild memory guided him. Wildness does not vanish easily. Even stripped of guidance, even when hunger bites hard, the core of survival remains. The ranger's role was not to supply answers, but to shape the questions so the cub could answer them himself. Compassion meant giving space, not control. Parallel stories echoed in his mind. In Kenya, lion cubs separated from their prides often failed to develop hunting skills even when fed. Some became dependent, waiting near lodges, their future reduced to enclosures. Others were introduced to sanctuaries where workers tried to teach stalking with tethered prey. Success was rare. Lions learn within a family, their strength born from teamwork. For solitary grizzly cubs, however, survival is individual. Independence is not optional, it is everything. That difference gave Daniel a thread of hope. Still, the work was fragile. Every time the cub lifted his head at the sound of Daniel's truck, the risk of habituation loomed. He could not let the bear connect food with him. So he changed tactics. Sometimes he left no food at all, forcing the cub to search. He rotated spots, ensuring no single location became predictable. He even skipped entire days, resisting the urge to check, so the cub learned hunger could only be eased through effort. There were setbacks. Once he watched as the cub failed to catch a trout in the shallows, paws splashing wildly while the fish darted away. He collapsed on the bank, panting, defeated. Daniel's fingers tightened on the wheel, tempted to step down with a fish from his cooler. He stayed put. Hours later, the cub tried again, slower this time, quieter. His paw struck true. And for the first time, Daniel saw him hold a live fish between his teeth. The sight sent a jolt through his chest. The cub was learning. Wildlife biologists, reviewing his notes, later confirmed what Daniel sensed: the cub was developing natural foraging skills. His behavior mirrored that of wild-born cubs, only slower, clumsier. The key difference was exposure. Without a mother's teaching, he had to rely on instinct shaped by opportunity. Daniel's hidden hand provided those opportunities, but never the comfort of human presence. That line mattered. It was the thin thread that separated a wild survivor from a dependent orphan. A fresh perspective came to Daniel one dusk as he watched the cub tug bark from a tree for sap. The cub was not just surviving, he was becoming a teacher himself. For every ranger, every biologist who later read these observations, his struggle would shape understanding. Conservation was not only about saving lives, it was about learning how resilience unfolds when wild creatures are left space to grow. The cub's life was a storybook, written in paw prints and bite marks. a reminder that sometimes the most powerful lessons in wildlife come not from intervention, but from patience. Daniel also began reflecting on his own place in the story. He realized that the urge to step in to feed to soothe often came more from his discomfort than the cub's need. Humans dislike watching struggle, but struggle is where growth hides. He began to see the cub's hunger not just as pain, but as a teacher. Each empty belly made the next discovery more valuable, more deeply imprinted. In that sense, hunger was not an enemy, it was a mentor. Weeks passed. The cub's movements grew stronger. His coat thickened, his ribs less visible. He no longer waited at the exact spots Daniel favored, but roamed farther, following scent trails beyond sight. Daniel knew this was good. Independence was emerging. Still, he carried the weight of what might come. A cub without fear of humans could still wander into campsites. A cub too comfortable near roads could still meet the end of a bumper. The path ahead was uncertain. But for now, watching him pry open a log, chew eagerly on beetle larvae, Daniel allowed himself a rare smile. Against odds, the little bear was learning to be wild. To help without taking away wildness requires discipline. True support is often quiet, almost invisible. The less the cub recognized Daniel's hand, the better his chances. Compassion in the wild is restraint wrapped in patience. Yet even as Daniel celebrated small victories, the wilderness whispered reminders. One night, a motion camera captured shadows circling the cub's foraging ground. Wolves. Predators sensed weakness, and suddenly the fragile experiment of survival was no longer about lessons, it was about life or death. The trail camera lit up just after midnight. Daniel Harris sat in the ranger station, reviewing the footage, the glow of the screen, the only light in the room. First came the cub nosing through a patch of brush, chewing on insects. Then, faint but undeniable shapes moved in from the edge of the frame. Sleek bodies, tails held low. A wolf pack circling silently. The cub froze ears flat. For seconds that felt like hours, he stood still, then darted toward the fallen pines. The wolves followed shadows fading from the screen. The recording ended before showing the outcome. Daniel exhaled, heart pounding, even though he knew this was hours old. He would check the area at dawn. Until then, he sat with the reality pressing in for an orphaned grizzly bear cub. Danger was not occasional, it was constant. Predators shaped the rhythm of Yellowstone. Wolves, cougars, and even adult male bears patrol the same valleys. Each sees a cub not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Biologists remind us that mortality among cubs is part of the ecosystem's balance. A lost cub can mean food for others. Life flows into life no matter how brutal it looks through human eyes. Yet for Daniel, knowing the science didn't soften the ache. He had come to see the cub as more than a statistic. The next morning he found tracks. Tiny bear prints leading away from the creek, overlapping with larger paw marks wolf tracks. He followed cautiously, scanning for signs of struggle. Near a charred log, he spotted tufts of brown fur caught on bark. His chest tightened. Then farther on, he saw the cub himself, limping slightly but alive, pawing at the earth for roots. Relief washed over him, heavy and temporary. The cub had survived the night, but there would be more nights, more shadows circling. Wildlife biologists explained to Daniel later that cub mortality rates can reach 50% in the first year. Hunger, predators, and harsh weather all conspire against survival. A mother bear defends her young with teeth and sheer size. Alone, a cub's defense is hiding, running, or luck, and luck is rarely enough. An example from Africa echoed in Daniel's mind. Orphan lion cubs often fall prey to hyenas or leopards within days. The absence of adults shifts them from hunter to hunted. Nature rarely grants sympathy. The same rules applied here. Every howl in the night was a reminder that the cub's story balanced on a knife's edge. Daniel struggled with the temptation to interfere more directly. He imagined building a shelter, staying close with rifle in hand, scaring off predators. But he knew what that would mean. Dependence, familiarity, the unraveling of everything he had worked to preserve. The cub needed to learn fear of wolves, not protection from them. Fear is part of survival. Without it, he would approach danger head-on. So Daniel held back even when holding back hurt. That restraint revealed a small lesson. Sometimes protection is not shielding from danger, but allowing creatures to face it. Resilience grows not in comfort, but in trial. The cub, limping forward, still searching for food, showed more strength than any human help could have given him. It was a reminder that struggle is not always cruelty, it can be preparation. Still, the risks loomed large. Beyond predators, other dangers pressed in. Vehicles on park roads posed silent threats. Daniel remembered cases of bear cubs struck while crossing highways drawn to the scent of carrion. Human campsites carried lures of leftover food. One wrong step into a campground and the cub could be labeled a nuisance, setting in motion the cycle that ends with relocation or worse. To survive, he needed not only food and strength, but also the invisible shield of caution around human presence. That was the paradox. Daniel's quiet support had to keep him alive without making him trust people. A fresh perspective emerged one morning as Daniel watched the cub dig at a hillside. Ravens gathered nearby, waiting for scraps. Wolves lingered in the distance, watching. The cub stood in the middle of a web of connections. His survival was not isolated. If he fell, others would eat. If he lived, he would one day hunt, shaping the lives of prey. Every outcome fits into a larger story. From this angle, danger was not only a threat, it was the ecosystem's way of weaving balance. The cub was not a victim set apart, but a thread in the fabric of Yellowstone. Daniel began to see that his role was less about saving and more about witnessing. By documenting the cub's trials, he was capturing a truth rarely seen up close, the razor-thin margin between survival and loss. His notes, his photos, even the shaky trail camera footage all became a testament to resilience in the face of danger. For viewers years from now, it would be more than a bear story. It would be a window into the costs of wildness. Yet knowledge did not erase emotion. Each time he saw the cub flinch at a distant howl, Daniel's instincts screamed to step closer. He had to remind himself that courage for a ranger sometimes meant walking away. Leaving the cub to his battles was not abandonment, it was trust in the ancient design of the wild. As summer deepened, the cub grew stronger. His muscles filled out his movements steadier. But danger never receded. One dusk, Daniel spotted him face to face with a lone coyote. The cub stood tall, bluffing with a growl too small for his body. The coyote hesitated, then trotted off. It was a minor victory, but Daniel knew it mattered. Each confrontation, each escape was a lesson etched into the cub's instincts. Lessons no human could teach. The wild does not grant safety, but it does offer wisdom through danger. Every close call carved resilience into the cub's bones. For Daniel, the challenge was not to erase those dangers, but to respect them as teachers. Still another challenge crept closer, one no predator had posed. The cub was beginning to link survival not just to rivers and roots, but to the rumble of Daniel's truck. And that bond, though born from kindness, carried dangers of its own. By midsummer, the cub had grown heavier, fur thicker, and stride more confident. He no longer stumbled when fishing or pawing at logs. Yet Daniel Harris noticed something that unsettled him more than the nights filled with wolves. The cub had begun waiting near the road, lifting his head at the faint rumble of the ranger truck long before Daniel appeared. The sight should have been triumphant proof he had survived. Instead, it tightened Daniel's chest. The cub was beginning to link the sound of an engine with survival. Habituation is a sterile word in reports, but in practice it means a wild animal crosses an invisible line. The natural caution that should keep him away from people starts to fade. Biologists warn that habituated bears become problem animals. They approach campgrounds, sniff garbage, and sometimes show aggression when food is withheld. Rangers know how those stories end: relocation at best, euthanasia at worst. The phrase "a fed bear is a dead bear" echoed in Daniel's mind each time the cub trotted toward him, tail flicking with expectation. He tried new tactics. Instead of placing the fish as soon as he arrived, he waited. He parked far back, turned off the engine, and stayed inside the truck until the cub wandered to forage on his own. Some days he left nothing at all, watching through binoculars as hunger drove the cub to overturn stones or dig roots. But the bond was already growing. The cub often lingered near the truck long after Daniel had left, as though unwilling to accept the absence of food. Daniel remembered a case from a few years earlier, black bear cubs near Yosemite that had learned to associate coolers with meals. At first, it was charming tourists laughing as cubs pawed picnic tables. Within a season, it turned dangerous. Rangers had to put down 3 young bears after repeated incidents. They had lost their fear and with it, their future. That memory haunted him as he watched this grizzly cub shadow his movements. One afternoon, the cub padded so close to the truck that Daniel could see each fleck of dirt on his paws. He stood on his hind legs, sniffing at the open window. For a moment, the ranger felt the absurd urge to reach out to touch the creature who had become both subject and student. He gripped the steering wheel instead, knuckles white. If he gave in to that impulse, he would erase months of discipline. Kindness without boundaries becomes harm. What begins as rescue can slide into control, stripping an animal of the very independence that defines him. Daniel realized that his role was not savior, but shadow. He was meant to create opportunities for wildness, not become the center of it. Biologists reviewing his reports offered blunt feedback. Step back more. Limit visits. Increase distance. They explained that cubs must learn not only to eat, but to distrust. Fear of people is not a flaw, it is armor. Without it, a bear grows bold in the wrong places. In Montana, grizzlies that wandered near ranches often ended up trapped or shot. In Wyoming, habituated cubs taken to sanctuaries never returned to the wild, living out their days in fenced spaces. The contrast was clear. Independence meant freedom. Dependence meant captivity or death. Daniel wrestled with the paradox. Each time he withheld food, he feared the cub might starve. Each time he offered food, he feared he was signing his death warrant. He began spacing his visits, sometimes leaving 2 or 3 days between patrols. The cub grew restless, but slowly began ranging farther, searching streams beyond the valley. One evening, Daniel spotted him from a ridge dragging a trout from shallow water with no help at all. The sight was both victory and warning. The cub was capable, yet still returned to the truck when the engine roared. The fresh perspective came unexpectedly during a conversation with a visiting wildlife photographer. She spoke about the ethics of her craft, how the hardest discipline was knowing when not to click the shutter. Interference can be as small as attention, she said. Even watching changes the story. Daniel carried those words into the field. He realized that his presence, even silent, shaped the cub's choices. To give him a real chance, the ranger would need to become less central, less familiar, until the cub stopped looking for him altogether. But that was easier to promise than to practice. One dusk, when Daniel prepared to drive away, the cub ran after the truck, limping slightly on his growing legs. He looked like a child chasing a parent. Daniel's chest ached. He threw a fish head far into the brush, using distraction as escape, then drove quickly before the cub returned. In the mirror, he saw him stop confused before lowering his nose to the scent trail. Relief and guilt collided in Daniel's chest. Independence cannot be taught by giving. It must be learned through space, through the tension of hunger and the sting of solitude. What feels cruel in the moment may be the only kindness that preserves wildness. The struggle was not only the cub's, it was Daniel's as well. He had to confront his own need to help his own discomfort with letting go. Each decision carved a question into his mind. Was he preparing the cub for the wilderness, or slowly tying him to humans in ways he might never escape? By late summer, the cub was stronger, more skilled. He dug confidently for roots, overturned heavy logs, and fished with less clumsiness. Yet every sighting near the road, every eager step toward the ranger truck reminded Daniel of the fragile line they walked together. One more wrong move and survival would shift from wilderness to dependency. Habituation is not only an animal's loss of fear, it is also a mirror held up to people, showing how our compassion can blur into control. To keep wild animals truly wild requires humility, the willingness to step back even when every instinct says step closer. That humility would soon be tested. For one evening, as the sun bled across the ridges, the cub limped into Daniel's campfire glow with a thorn lodged in his paw. And in that moment of vulnerability, the bond between ranger and bear would be pushed to its breaking point. The evening was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every crackle of a campfire sound like thunder. Daniel Harris had set up a small base not far from the creek, his truck parked behind him, notes spread out on the tailgate. He was sketching maps of the cub's roaming patterns when he heard soft movement in the brush. He looked up, expecting the rustle of deer. Instead, the grizzly bear cub limped into the firelight, one paw held gingerly above the ground. A thorn, sharp and buried deep, glinted against the swollen pad. The cub stopped, eyes fixed on Daniel, then lowered himself slowly, almost as if asking for help. The ranger's chest tightened. He knew what he was supposed to do: observe, document, let nature run its course. But the cub's trust cut through protocol like it wasn't even there. With careful steps, Daniel knelt. He spoke in a low voice, not soothing, not calling, simply steady. The cub didn't move. When Daniel reached for the first aid kit, amber eyes followed his hands. He poured saline, gently flushed the wound, and eased the thorn out with tweezers. The cub flinched but didn't pull away. For a moment, wilderness and humanity stood inches apart, bound by pain and care. When the paw was wrapped loosely in gauze, Daniel leaned back. The cub shifted, then lay near the fire, licking his bandaged foot, the glow painting his fur gold. It was the closest they had ever been. And it was the moment Daniel realized their bond had gone too far. A wild animal should never feel safe in a human's camp. Trust, which felt like triumph, was also a warning. He thought of cases he had studied: cubs rescued and raised in zoos, safe but restless. Some paced endlessly, wearing grooves in the ground. Others stared at crowds with eyes dulled by confinement. They had survived, but at a cost. Wildness had been replaced with dependence. The question echoed: was survival without freedom really survival at all? Daniel stared at the cub and understood that his choices had carried them here. Each strip of fish, each scent trail, each watchful hour had drawn the cub closer. Now he came not just for food, but for presence. And if that pattern continued, the outcome was clear. The cub would never truly belong to Yellowstone. He would belong to the memory of a ranger's kindness, and that would kill him faster than any wolf. Sometimes love means leaving. True care for wild animals does not bind them closer, but pushes them back into the wilderness where they belong. To hold on is comfort for the human, but a risk for the animal. To let go is painful, but it is also respect. He tested the idea in his mind, wondering if he had the strength. Could he step away now, knowing the cub might still starve or fall prey? Could he live with the uncertainty? Or was it more selfish to keep showing up, feeding him enough to survive while shaping him into something half wild, half domesticated? A biologist he once trained with had told him, the goal of conservation isn't to save individuals at all costs. It's to preserve the system that allows wildness to thrive. Those words, once abstract, now struck like stone. Daniel realized that keeping the cub tied to him, however lightly, was eroding that system. He had to give the bear a chance to live as a bear, not as a dependent shadow of human compassion. The next morning, he placed a final fish far from camp. He stood long enough to watch the cub find it pounce with energy and chew hungrily. Then he turned and walked to his truck. The cub lifted his head, gauze still hanging loose, eyes searching. He took 2 steps forward as if to follow. Daniel threw another fish head into the brush farther away. The cub veered off, distracted. With a heavy breath, Daniel climbed in, started the engine, and drove without looking back. In the mirror, though, he saw the cub pause, meat clamped in his jaws, gaze fixed on the retreating vehicle. Confusion, almost betrayal, flickered in his eyes. Daniel gripped the wheel, fighting the urge to turn around. He whispered into the empty cab, "You're better off without me." The fresh perspective came as the miles passed. He realized that goodbye is not always the end of a story. It is sometimes the beginning of a truer one. By stepping back, he was not abandoning the cub, but giving him the dignity of wildness. Survival was no longer something Daniel could deliver. It was something the cub had to claim for himself. He returned to the ranger station, notes and photos heavy in his pack. He decided not to go back to the valley again. Instead, he would focus on documenting from afar, reviewing trail cameras and scanning ridges without approaching. The cub's next steps would be his own. Whether he thrived or fell, it would be as a bear, not as a ward of human kindness. To protect wild animals sometimes means resisting the deepest human impulse to nurture, to hold close. Letting go is not weakness, but discipline, the kind that ensures creatures remain what they are meant to be. Weeks later, Daniel caught sight of the cub from a distant ridge. Stronger now, ribs hidden under new muscle, he overturned a fallen log and ate beetle larvae with focus. Daniel lowered his binoculars, chest heavy but proud. The cub was learning to live on his own, and soon, Daniel would have to decide how to share this story with the world without betraying the wildness he had fought to preserve. From the ridge above Yellowstone's northern range, Daniel Harris lifted his binoculars one last time. The sun was dipping low, staining the meadow in amber. There, near a fallen cottonwood, the grizzly bear cub pried open a log tongue, darting at the insects inside. No truck waited nearby. No scent trails had been laid. This was his own discovery. Daniel lowered the glass slowly, letting the moment sink in. The cub was not waiting for him anymore. He was learning to wait in the wilderness. That sight carried more weight than any rescue. It was proof that letting go had been the right choice. The temptation to keep feeding, to keep showing up, would have chained the cub to dependency. But distance had given him freedom. The wilderness had taken over where human hands stopped. For Daniel, the relief was sharp, but it was laced with something else, loss. He had invested weeks, even pieces of himself, into the cub's fragile survival. Walking away meant carrying uncertainty forever. In conservation, there are rarely tidy endings. Wildlife biologists often remind us that cub mortality is a natural part of ecosystems. Not every life can be saved, nor should it. Balance depends on struggle on predators and prey on the young that fall and the ones that endure. That truth doesn't ease the ache of goodbye, but it reframes it. By refusing to claim the cub as his own, Daniel honored the ancient design that keeps wild places whole. This experience reshaped his understanding of his role. He was not there to be a savior, not there to bend nature toward human comfort. His responsibility was stewardship, helping just enough to tip survival toward a possibility, but never so much that he erased wildness. That balance is delicate. It asks for discipline, humility, and sometimes heartbreak. And yet it is in that heartbreak that true respect for animals grows. The wild is not ours to fix, but ours to respect. A grizzly bear cub does not need a human to become whole. He needs space, challenge, and the freedom to succeed or fail on his own. When we interfere too deeply, we risk trading their future for our comfort. When we step back, even when it hurts, we give them the dignity of being what they are meant to be. His story drew parallels across the world. In Africa, lion cubs orphaned too soon sometimes find sanctuaries. Some live long lives, but they never know the hunt, never taste independence. In North America, black bear cubs, rescued near campgrounds, are often reared behind fences kept safe but cut off from the forest. These stories remind us that rescue is not always salvation. The highest gift we can give wild animals is the chance to remain wild. Daniel's journals, filled with sketches and notes, became more than personal records. They turned into a resource for future rangers, a reminder of the razor-thin line between helping and harming. His photographs captured not staged moments of closeness, but quiet images of resilience, clumsy fishing attempts, cautious foraging, the first triumphant catch. He chose not to publish them immediately, knowing how easily such images could inspire copycats who might feed or tame wild animals for the sake of a picture. Instead, he held them close, waiting for a time when the story could be shared with honesty about its complexity. What began as an encounter with one hungry cub grew into a mirror held up to all of us. How often do we step into nature with good intentions without realizing how our presence reshapes the lives we touch? The cub's story asks us to examine our own role, not just as admirers of wild animals, but as guardians of their right to remain untamed. Knowledge emerged alongside emotion. Daniel learned, and we learn with him, that cub mortality sustains balance. That fear of humans is not cruelty, but protection. That hunger can be a teacher, not just a burden. That independence is fragile and must be defended even against our instincts to hold close. These truths are not abstract. They decide whether wild animals endure or vanish. And beyond knowledge, there is emotion. The ache of watching a cub limp toward you for help. The relief of seeing him find food on his own. The sting of driving away while he watches you disappear. These emotions remind us that conservation is not just science, it is a story. It is the thread of connection between the human heart and the wild creature, woven in moments of choice. Conservation is not about what we take into our hands, but about what we release back into the wild. Every decision matters, not just for rangers, but for all of us. Tourists who toss scraps at a campsite, hikers who crowd too close for a photo, photographers who bait animals for a shot. Each small act tips the scale. We can choose respect instead. We can choose to let animals teach themselves, to let them keep the fear that keeps them safe. As Daniel closed his notebook for the last time, he whispered to the empty room, "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away." It was not resignation, it was reverence. The cub's survival would remain uncertain, but his wildness had been preserved. And that in the end was victory. Now I turn the question toward you. What would you have done in Daniel's place? Would you have fed the cub or walked away? How do you balance compassion with respect for wildness in your own life? Take a moment to reflect on your role, not just as a witness, but as a steward of the wild stories unfolding around us. And if this journey moved you, if it made you feel the fragile beauty of wild animals and the weight of our choices, I invite you to stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join a community that believes in protecting the untamed, because the wild needs voices, yours, mine, and ours together.